Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the Politics Guys with your hosts, Jay Carson and Michael Baranowski.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. My co-host this week, as always, is Cleveland area attorney and sometime Republican strategist Jay Carson. After a 2-week hiatus while I was on vacation, the Politics Guys newsletter is back. This week's issue features my thoughts on President Trump's tax returns, Leah on the Trump budget and the hollow state, and Joe on immigration and American liberalism. To get the newsletter, just go to our website, politicsguys.com, and sign up on the form you'll see there. You can also check out previous issues by clicking on the past newsletters link above the sign-up form. Also, I want to let everyone know about a great service I've been using for a while now, Craft Coffee. I'm a pretty big coffee geek, but I've always had a tough time getting high-quality, freshly roasted beans that don't cost a small fortune. After trying out a bunch of different options, I found Craft Coffee. They send me a bag of beans every few weeks. I can customize the delivery schedule to whatever I want for only $11.99. It's roasted just a few days before they ship it to me, and shipping is free. Most important, it tastes great. So why am I telling you this? Well, they're not paying me to do this. This isn't an advertisement, but Craft Coffee is offering us a deal. If you sign up using my special promo code, you get 15% off and I get a free bag of coffee. So it's a win-win. If you're interested, go to craftcoffee.com, and when you sign up, use the promo code N5F-SQV. Again, that promo code for 15% off is N5F-SQV. And now, on to this week's show. There's so much going on this week, but, in my view, the most important story, and the one we're going to start with this week, was the release of President Trump's budget proposal. Now, the president's budget increases defense spending by $54 billion, calls for more money for border security and immigration judges, and requests $1.7 billion in 2017 and an additional $2.6 billion in 2018 to start construction of that Mexico border wall. Now, these increases are offset with major cuts at a number of agencies, including reductions of more than 20% at the Agriculture, Labor, and State Departments, and more than 30% at the Environmental Protection Agency. And even though Republicans control both the House and the Senate, it's highly unlikely that the budget Congress passes will include all of the administration's proposed cuts, as both Democrats and Republicans have objected to many of these reductions. So, Jay, what's your take on the budget proposal?
I think it's sort of what one would expect from Donald Trump, the negotiator. He's setting out sort of his beginning bargaining position, and he's leaving plenty of room to maneuver to make a deal down the road. I firmly believe that, and we'll see as how things play out. But I think he has to understand that obviously all these cuts are not going to happen. Cuts hardly ever happen. But as a conservative, it's refreshing to see them actually proposed and to put sort of the onus on the various agencies to come and sort of justify what their budget requests are. And they may well be justified or they may not. But I think it's a good mindset to have. To say, look, let's start from paring back and then see what you really need.
Well, what about the other side of it? I mean, there's the paring back side, and I think you can make a reasonable conservative case for that. Though, of course, this budget is neutral in that sense, where he cuts, but he also puts in place or asks for a number of pretty big increases. That $54 billion for defense. I mean, do we need that, or several $billion for a border wall and so forth? What do you think about that aspect of it?
Well, again, I think that's going to be part of the negotiation. I mean, that's going to be something that Trump's going to have to to give back as things move forward. You ask for more than what you think you're going to need, and you work back from there. I think there's a good argument to be made on the conservative side that if we're going to adjust our spending, it ought to be more on the military and defense end, simply because the military has become degraded over years. And there's a lot of catching up that needs to be done. But I think the numbers, it's something he's gonna horse trade.
Well, on the military side of thing, you say it's become degraded and so forth. And I wonder if it's not so much that as we're just overextended, and maybe we need to take a look at some of these commitments. And I mean, we put a ton of money into the military, far more than anyone else. And if we're going to ask programs to justify their existence, why don't we start with the single biggest program in terms of discretionary spending, and that's the military, instead of picking on, the EPA, the Agriculture Department. If you're looking to cut the budget and be fiscally responsible, don't you go where most of the money is?
Well, I think he probably would, when you consider what he's talking about. A lot is upgrades in terms of our capabilities rather than continuing operations. The military expenditures we've had of late have been more, forward focused. I mean, we're actually fighting wars as opposed to building up capabilities, maintenance, so forth. So, and I think Trump's been pretty clear throughout his campaign, and I think he's skeptical of foreign wars. I mean, there's certainly room there, but I think it's going to be subject to the various sorts of wheeling and dealing that is supposed to be his strongest suit.
Yeah. Well, we're
going to see him. Yeah. I think a lot of people sort of looked at the upside of Trump. I know something that I looked at the upside is if you have someone who is more or less non-ideological, who can go in there and just again cut deals to make things run again. There is some appeal to that, and I think Trump is that.
Well,
he's non-ideological to a certain extent.
Well, so. Yeah, I would disagree. At least, I've said before that you can tell a lot about a person by the sort of budget proposal he has, the spending priorities, that sort of thing. And this to me seems to be an extremely ideological budget. It's the standard sort of Republican playbook of putting a lot of money into defense without asking for any sort of justification, and just trying to cut to the bone all sorts of domestic programs. And so,
yet Republicans are objecting to it.
Well, yeah, because the cuts to some of these programs are even more draconian than even some Republicans would like. Now, that's especially things like the State Department is one big thing that a number of Republicans, including I believe Mitch McConnell, are saying this just isn't going to happen. But to me, it's a typical Republican budget, but even a little bit worse. And one thing I think that's been underreported in all this is the huge problem of mandatory spending. The Congressional,
I agree on that.
To just be clear to listeners, mandatory spending, then that includes interest payments on our debt. That's around 70% of our entire federal budget. So this sort of budget proposal is kind of not so much tinkering on the edges, but the vast bulk of our budget is what's called mandatory spending. What that means is spending that essentially Congress has to do by law unless they change the law. And we're talking about largely Social Security, Medicare, that sort of thing. And if you take a look at the numbers, CBO estimates that in 2018 our deficit's going to be just under $500 billion, rising to around $1 trillion by 2023. And that's driven almost entirely by an aging population, healthcare cost increases, and a lot more money going to pay off interest on the debt. And so for people who are deficit hawks, and supposedly, Donald Trump's budget director this is not a really great budget because it really doesn't do a whole lot in terms of that. And, I think that's a legitimate concern going forward. And certainly a lot of conservatives have that concern. They believe that that's why we need to look at these programs. And on my side of thing, I believe that we need to restructure our tax system so we make sure we have the revenues to honor these commitments without going into debt, greater debt.
Well, I'd say 2 points to that. The first being, I think the administration is looking at this budget as, again, a moving forward operating budget with the idea that if there's going to be some other big entitlement reform, that's going to be a separate bill. Some of that will be taken up in the healthcare bill, and others in possible other fixes down the road. So I don't know that they're trying to solve all the problems at once. I think the second point is to some extent, there's always the argument when you're cutting programs of, look, this is in the big picture, it's chump change. There are various small programs that we used to call earmarks that by themselves have no serious fiscal impact on the government. But the idea is that if you can't even cut those, how are you ever going to get up the political courage to tackle entitlements and the real problems? And maybe you have to start small and take on some of these other trimming issues before you get to the real big ones.
I hear what you say. I don't buy that argument. I understand the logic of it, but I don't think it really necessarily follows. My guess is that we're not going to see the tax reform part of this. We're not going to see any serious changes to that. And I think until we get
I think you will. I think there's going to be a tax reform bill.
We'll see. The last one was 1986. I don't think that we're in any kind of a position. I mean, and back then, of course, there was a lot less partisan polarization in Congress. I don't think we're going to see it. I hope I'm wrong. I think we're long overdue now. You and I might differ in terms of what that would look like, but we can both agree that that's definitely something that needs to be done in a big way. Before we move on, I want to point out some people are using the term skinny budget to talk about this budget, and I just want to explain kind of the listeners what that means. The skinny budget's a term that's used to describe the first budget of a new president because they're just sort of coming into office, getting their feet wet. And so these budgets tend to be not as detailed. So some people who were comparing President Trump's first budget to President Obama's last budget, that's kind of an unfair comparison. I mean, Trump's budget's 53 pages compared to 182 in the last Obama budget. But if you take a look at, even if you take a look at skinny budgets, Trump's is still skinnier than most. For instance, Obama's first skinny budget was 134 pages. George W. Bush's was 207 pages. Bill Clinton's was 145 pages. But the point being is that these first budgets tend to be a lot less detailed than most. And as we know, Donald Trump is not really a big detail guy. But so this is a skinny budget, though it is a little bit skinnier than most people's skinny budgets. All right. Moving on, you mentioned healthcare a little bit, Jay, and of course, last week you and Ken had what I thought was a great discussion about the American Health Care Act, which is the House Republicans' proposed replacement for Obamacare. Now, this week, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office came out with their analysis of the bill, concluding that it would add 24 million people to the rolls of the uninsured while saving $337 billion by 2026. It would also stabilize individual insurance markets and lower average premium prices, but only by making coverage so expensive for older and sicker Americans that they wouldn't be able to afford it and would be forced to go without any insurance. The CBO report was worse than many people had predicted, and between that and the conservative revolt against what they're calling Obamacare Light or Ryan Care, I don't see this going anywhere without major changes. I mean, President Trump's surrogates and his fans in the right-wing media have been consistently calling this, as I said, Ryan Care, trying to distance the president. And I honestly can't imagine the president expending a ton of political capital on a proposal that's so disliked by so many people. Jay, what do you think?
I think, first, Trump did come back and say he supports the bill, although
was that in quotes?
He appears to be working to get more votes for it. That said, the way he works is he's going to have to make deals, and that means he's going to have to make some alterations, probably radical alterations. I think as it stands now, they don't have the votes in the Senate.
Not even close. They might not even have the votes in the House.
Talking again with the 51 votes, not even considering, if you were to have a bill that did more and would have to couldn't go through the reconciliation process, would have to meet the 60 vote requirement, that would be even more difficult.
Right.
But I think there's sort of a fascinating discussion going on about, how exactly we do this. There's one school in the Republican camp that says, this is sort of the Paul Ryan school, let's take what we can get starting off, and then we will make other changes down the road. Now, those other changes would be reductions in various regulatory requirements that in theory lower the cost to insurers, reducing some of the mandates on insurers, and those are things that wouldn't have to be done legislatively, but could be done by rule. And then, part three of this three-part plan would be another piece of legislation that would address more substantive issues, for example, selling insurance across state lines and so forth. But it would be of a nature that it couldn't go through the reconciliation process. So I think those are the things at play in how we handle this. And you've got conservatives who want to go for the whole enchilada at once, and the Ryan team that wants to sort of take what you can get. So I mean, we'll see how this plays out. As far as the CBO thing, I mean, I'm a little skeptical just because of the CBO's track record, particularly on Obamacare. They were off by a margin of about more than 50%. So I'm not sure that their predictions, actually come to fruition. If you look at what else. Could be done regulatory wise.
I want to address that. Now, I think it's fair to say that, at least I believe, that any sort of long-term predictions out 8, 9, 10 years should be taken with a grain of salt. And, you're absolutely right. And a number of other conservatives have pointed this out, that on Obamacare, the CBO made some predictions that clearly were not right. And so I think that's not to necessarily completely denigrate the CBO. The CBO probably has the best nonpartisan predictions. Certainly, they're going to be a lot more fair-minded than predictions from either the left or the right. But when we're talking about these predictions, it's, we're talking about a big programs with a lot of moving parts and so forth, and it's really difficult to predict. So these are the best numbers we have. They're certainly not gospel, but they're going to be better than numbers that you're going to get from, say, Donald Trump or Paul Ryan, because they're so incredibly self-interested, where at least the CBO tries to do things in a nonpartisan way. So one other thing I wanted to mention is that in that, the CBO also mentioned that it's not actually the case that Obamacare is in a death spiral. They expected premium rates to settle out in that as well. And so some people are saying, well, if you just gave Obamacare a little bit of time to stabilize, things would be better than certainly under this Ryan Care thing or Obamacare Light, where so many people lose their insurance. But to me, it seems like, number one, probably the best thing that could be done would be to make a simple policy fix, and that's to give the current Obamacare coverage mandate more teeth, to make it more of a punitive thing. That way you get more healthy people signing up, and that would help to kind of balance things off and stabilize the market.
People need to be punished further.
No, people need to be made to. I mean, you and Ken talked about this last week, how insurance works and so forth. And for it to work, I think you need more people to sign up. But maybe that's another discussion. But a second thing, and this is something I think you might actually agree with me on, Jay, is that I think, Donald Trump has said in the past that he supports allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices, something currently that Medicare is not allowed to do. But House Republicans, who are so deep in the pockets of Big Pharma, don't want to see this happen at all. And this, I think, would be a great way to help lower some costs, control some costs. But while the president says he's for that, and I salute him for being for that, he's not going to get much buy-in from Congress on this.
Well, I think that's actually a decent argument to be made on that. I think it's a good argument in the Senate. My concern, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this because I may be wrong, but I don't think that that's something you can do in the reconciliation process.
Right. I think you may be right about that. And
I think that's a substantive change that would have to go get the 60 votes in the Senate.
Yeah, I think you might be right about that. But I think actually that's something that probably could get 60 votes. I mean, I think there are Democrats and Republicans. And so if we're looking for bipartisan agreement on certain things, that's something that might actually work, though I think that Paul Ryan and a number of Republicans would just say, we're not going to do that. And certainly Big Pharma would freak out, and there would be an awful lot of lobbying muscle pushed to make sure that didn't happen.
I want to make one of the final sort of philosophical point on this, and that with the CBO numbers, a certain percentage, and the last number I saw was something about 14 million of those that they say would lose coverage. I'm not clear if it's exactly losing coverage. It's just a matter of they would not get coverage if they were no longer forced to get coverage. And I think that's a little different. I mean, if there were people who didn't want health insurance in the first place, and then they were required to do it by fear of taxation, I understand there's the policy goal if you want more people in the pool, but at the same time, I don't know that it's right to say that they've lost health insurance coverage if they never wanted it in the first place.
That's a fair point.
Doing it under compulsion.
Yeah, that's a fair point, I think. But certainly also you recognize that there'll be millions of people who will want insurance, or will want coverage, whether it's through the individual market or through Medicaid, who won't be able to get it if this goes through.
And here was another interesting point. There was a piece in the Wall Street Journal, I want to say last Tuesday, talking about that the number of people, of that 14 million, there would be a certain percentage who would be Medicaid eligible, but still wouldn't sign up unless they're forced to do it.
Sure. I saw that piece. Right.
You're sort of saying, well, look, if this is such a great program and a free program, you got to, and yet you have to force people to do it. Maybe it's not so great.
Sure.
Now, I would differ in, I think probably a lot of those people who aren't signing up aren't necessarily thinking through, no, I'd rather have no coverage than have Medicaid. I think they're just not signing up because they're not joiners.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Well, no, and there's you said you wanted to get philosophical, and I'll get a little bit philosophical too. There is an argument to be made about, the extent to which government should force people to do things for their own good. And you and I stand on slightly different sides of this argument, obviously, whereas, conservatives, especially libertarian type conservatives, would say, well, no. And if they don't want to do it, that freedom interest should be paramount. And then they have to suffer the consequences of their actions.
Right. You don't want to eat your vegetables? Right. I'm not going to make you.
My argument would be, and I think to a certain extent you might be a little bit sympathetic, the way we have the system set up nowadays is that we allow people to kind of do their own thing, but then when they get into real trouble, we feel like we have to help them out. And so it ends up costing the system more in the end. And, we could talk about that with banks and financial institutions, I think, to a certain extent.
You're correct in their requirement that emergency rooms have to provide emergency treatment, so that those costs get passed on to someone, no matter what.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but it'll be fascinating to see how this plays out. I think both you and I agree that our current system is an unholy mess. I don't know that this is going to fix it any, but we certainly need to do something, I think.
Yeah.
All right. Before we move on, we'd like to thank our new supporters this week. We have two new continuing supporters through Patreon. First is Chris, and also we have Scott. I don't know where Chris or Scott are from, but wherever you guys are from, we really appreciate your support. It helps keep the show going, and it means a great deal to us.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys. And now, if you're
assuming Chris is a guy, right?
Yeah, that's true.
We don't worry. Chris could be a woman also.
We'll assume Scott is a guy, though.
Right.
But if you're interested in supporting the show financially, you can do what Chris and Scott did last week. Just go to politicsguys.com, click on either the Patreon or PayPal donation links. You'll see there. Every donation helps, no matter what the amount is. It's especially helpful, as I mentioned, to have those continuing monthly supporters, which is real easy to set up through Patreon. And, finally, it would also be a big help if you could spread the word about the show, share and retweet our new show posts on Facebook and Twitter, and leave reviews and ratings of the show on iTunes. Okay, moving on. On March 6th, going back a little bit, President Trump issued a new and improved travel ban intended to get around the problems with his original travel ban of January 27th, which, of course, several federal judges prevented from going into effect, citing the potential unconstitutionality of various aspects. Now, this week, the same thing happened to the president's second try when federal judges in Hawaii and Maryland issued orders blocking the new ban. While the Trump administration claims it's not a religious ban, the judges both disagreed, citing comments made by Donald Trump as a candidate, as well as by Trump advisors Stephen Miller and Rudy Giuliani. Now, as Judge Watson wrote in the Hawaii case, a reasonable objective observer would see the new ban as issued with a purpose to disfavor a particular religion in spite of its stated religiously neutral purpose. The administration, of course, was not happy with this, with President Trump claiming that Judge Watson had made a political ruling and an appeal is in the works. Jay, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think this time Trump's got it right. Let me qualify that by saying, first of all, I think the idea of having the travel ban and so forth, it's really something that is probably not needed. Most people don't see the urgency to it. I don't know that he's made a great case that it's urgent. But that said, I think the court's ruling, taking this idea that we're going to look back at what a president said during a campaign, and what people like Rudy Giuliani, who has no real official position either in the campaign or in the cabinet, had said regarding this, and draw conclusions about the scope of presidential power based on that. It really is unprecedented, and I don't think it'll stand. I mean, I am in the same company with Alan Dershowitz on this, who says that he would see the U.S. Supreme Court rejecting this 8-0, overturning the lower court's decision 8-0. And the point is, look, you can agree or disagree whether it's good policy, but some of the standard ways, I mean, the paramount thing that a court looks at is they assume that the intent of a bill or an act or in this case, an executive order, resides in its actual language that it's used. And they are not to look beyond the four corners of that document unless there's some sort of ambiguity that might be informed by some sort of intent.
Let me disagree with you a little bit on that. I think if you can look back at prior federal court and Supreme Court precedents, there have been a number of instances in which Congress or the executive have done something specifically to get around a ruling of the court, and in those cases, and I don't have the case law right in front of me, but I can certainly provide that later on, that the court has said, no, you can't. This is clearly an attempt to get around this, and that's what the court is saying here, is that you said that you were going to institute a Muslim ban, a religious ban, which is unconstitutional under the Establishment Clause. And, you're phrasing it now in a way to try to sort of just squeak through, but we know what you're really doing. And I will grant you, Jay, that deference is owed to the democratically elected branches. I believe in that. I believe to a certain extent in that idea of judicial restraint. But I also think that when something seems to be a blatant and transparent attempt to institute a religious ban, then it's perfectly permissible for the courts to say, excuse me, we know what you're doing here.
Well, here's the thing, though, is it's not a Muslim ban or a religious ban. And you and I talked about this way back when during the campaigns. And I even said, well, geez, what they could do is you identify certain countries where there's jihad activity and you make a finding and say, listen, we are concerned about bringing people in from these countries which, have active Al-Qaeda or ISIS elements who are advocating the death to America. And I think that's pretty reasonable. And I think that's what, Rudy Giuliani probably told him at some point is, hey, look, Trump, you can't just say you're going to ban Muslims. But if your concern is banning potential jihadists, then here's how you would go about doing that. So it's sort of a can't-win situation if you're going to do this of, okay, I'm going to do something that is constitutional, but the court's going to say, yeah, but you're trying to do something, we know what you really think, so we're not going to let you do it anyway.
Well, yeah.
And I think it raises a whole bunch of other, there's the sort of often, sort of cliche about, judges are there to call balls and strikes. And this strikes me a little bit as, look, the pitcher throws one right over the plate, but the umpire says, yeah, he meant to pitch it low and outside. So I'm going to call it a ball. I mean, it's just.
Well, again, and I think this gets into sort of a a general philosophical differences. We're coming back to that again about, what is the proper role of the courts. And I get where you're coming from. And I think this is not necessarily a close case, but obviously, at least a couple of federal judges have seen it this way. I don't really think that the Supreme Court, I disagree with you and Dershowitz. I don't think if it got to the Supreme Court, it would be an 8-0 thing, but I can see where reasonable people would disagree on this. Now, the one thing it seems to me that you and I both agree on is that from a policy perspective, this is probably not a great idea. And I'll also point out that it seems to me that this is, in a way, kind of a big shame in the sense that I feel like Donald Trump has been sort of, trapped or co-opted or what have you by Steve Bannon and some of his nationalist rhetoric and so forth, where here he maybe had the opportunity to do important things that could really matter. And there's so much time and energy that's being wasted on this dumb, pointless policy that's sucking up so much attention and political capital. And it just seems to me to be such an incredible waste. And I would think that a lot of conservatives would feel that way too.
Well, I think so. I think my sense is, why do you want to pick this hill to die on?
Exactly. Exactly.
There's plenty of other fights that are more substantive that you could have, and this is distraction. Now, if I'm thinking in a purely Trumpian Bannon sort of political way, there is an advantage, and I'm going to be completely cynical Machiavellian even in this, in that, look, if there is a terror attack on U.S. soil by someone from one of these countries, Trump will be essentially exonerated.
Right.
He will, he'll be able to say, "Look, told you so," and it's the damn courts that wouldn't let me do it. I tried to protect you and I didn't. So if you're looking at this in a purely cynical, again, Machiavellian kind of way, there is that piece out there. Now, I don't know. Do these guys think this far ahead to get there? I don't know that they do. I think sometimes you just, you take whatever benefits you get as events happen. But
and again, this is
there is that.
Well, this is part of that whole kind of Steve Bannon alt-right sort of idea too. It fits in that whole thing about there are Americans, kind of white European types. Then there are these other dark people who don't share our values, who we're letting into this country, and we're losing our country. We need. I'm not.
There was never, Turks are welcome, Saudi Arabians are welcome. I mean,
but they're not really. I mean, that's the thing. I'm talking about how this fits into kind of that broader narrative of we need to keep America American. And I mean, this is something we saw. Was it Steve King, the nutty Iowa member of Congress, talking about and getting tweeted something about that, and I think there's this element of this. Now, I know you don't believe this, but there are clearly people who are close to Donald Trump, and Steve Bannon's one, who I think does believe this. And so all I'm saying is this kind of fits into this general kind of worldview about making sure that America stays kind of white European, essentially, which is something that it's becoming less and less of. That's all. So, okay. Anyway, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, look, I completely get that there can be people who oppose Israeli policy who are not anti-Semitic, that they can oppose Israeli policy just on the merits. By the same token, I think the left should acknowledge there are people who can say, we think there's a security threat.
Oh, sure.
From radical jihad, and that's not racist to think that.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's if I gave you that impression, I was saying that's I misspoke.
You. I'm just saying.
But yeah, I see what you're saying. Absolutely. Okay, moving on, Jay. The biggest non-story of the week, or at least the most overblown story, I think, of the week, was the so-called scoop that MSNBC's Rachel Maddow had about President Trump's tax returns. While Maddow did have some Trump tax return documents, there wasn't much. 2 pages of his 2005 return that told us, very little. We now know that Donald Trump made $150 million that year, paid $38 million in taxes, thanks to the alternative minimum tax, which he wants to eliminate. But we still don't know anything.
Can you blame him?
Well, yeah, but we still don't know anything about his investments and his financial relationships and his potential conflicts of interest, something I talk about in the newsletter this week. Now, the president initially claimed that he would release his returns once his IRS audit was over. You remember that, Jay, yeah?
Yeah.
But since then, he's gone back on the promise. His spokesperson, Kellyanne Conway, said the White House response is that he's not going to release his tax returns. We litigated this all through the election. People didn't care. They voted for him. Now, of course, more people voted for Hillary Clinton than him, but that's another story. So, Jay, what did you make out of all this?
I think it's sort of a big so what, and if anything, there was a benefit to Trump in that he paid $35 million in taxes. Which the narrative during the campaign was that based on losses that he had claimed earlier that he was paying no taxes, and maybe in some years he did pay no taxes. But
and this is the problem, right? Of 2 pages of 1 year of a return, and I mean there are some people who suggested that it's so favorable that maybe someone maybe Donald Trump himself leaked this, and he has a history of calling up reporters under assumed names and so forth and leaking stuff. It's not like he called himself Carlos Danger or anything like that, but it's another story. But he's done this in the past. This certainly does not make Donald Trump look bad at all. But I don't really think it tells us a whole lot. But it does, if it's not Donald Trump, and I think there's reason to believe that it's not Donald Trump who leaked this, certainly this kind of plays in this larger story about there being a lot of leaks inside the Trump administration, a lot of unhappy people. There was a story this week in Politico about how the Trump White House has become this incredibly paranoid, sort of like Nixonian paranoid sort of place, where everyone is
can you blame them?
Yeah, looking over their shoulder and so forth. And I mean, this administration is leaking like a sieve, and so it's entirely possible that we'll see more tax returns, though I don't know if that will happen. I certainly think it would be useful to happen, but I wouldn't hold your breath.
Yeah, I don't even know that it's particularly useful, except as you say, if there's some indication that he's got foreign business interests that ought to be disclosed.
Exactly.
That aren't. But the amount of money that Trump actually makes and the amount of tax he pays, provided that he's doing it, pursuant to the rules and regulations that we've got. I mean, that's kind of immaterial to me, and I think to a lot of people.
Now, what do you think about the idea? And some Democrats have proposed this. It's gotten nowhere, of course, of legislation that would require the major party presidential candidates to release their tax returns for the last decade or so.
I think it's a bad idea, just because I think it keeps good people out of the process at different levels. Because once it starts at the presidential level, it's going to go down to every other potential level, and
maybe
there are going to be people who just don't want to do that, just don't want that hassle.
Is it such a hassle, though, Jay? I mean, to be every presidential candidate except for Donald Trump for the last 40 years has done it. Here's the thing. It's really pretty easy to take some information from tax returns and misrepresent it. Sure, which is why you want to
or just to and there's also, people like to keep some of their financial dealings private.
I bet they do.
But no, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, in fact, that used to be something that was sort of a good thing. That was it was really sort of bad taste to go around talking about your holdings and your money and where you had it and so forth.
So you're not concerned that Donald Trump might have conflicts of interest he's not talking about that we would know about if we saw his tax returns, or at least certainly that we could settle the issue one way or another, either he did or he didn't. Or do you think not so much?
Not so much, and I'm not sure that the tax returns are necessarily going to tell you that. I guess the idea that this whole conflicts of interest, I'm still not clear exactly where that comes in. There's plenty of other disclosures that candidates make, and there's certainly political pressure on a presidential candidate to release tax returns.
Clearly not enough in this case,
there was a whole lot, but again, it wasn't a big enough issue for the people to say, look, we don't think we're going to vote for him because we haven't seen his tax returns. So
I hear what you're saying.
When there's no need to have more laws to make the process more difficult and to keep good people out of it, I just let the political system play out. And if people think it's important that they see their candidates' tax returns, then the candidates will either show them or they'll lose.
Okay. Moving on to, I guess what I'll call regrettable presidential tweets, which is, of course, a sadly regular story these days. The White House is not backing down in the face of bipartisan rejection of the president's Twitter claim that former President Obama illegally wiretapped him, which Trump, in a series of tweets called McCarthyism, a new low, Nixon Watergate, and the act of a bad or sick guy, meaning President Obama. Now, Press Secretary Sean Spicer, whose job to me seems more and more like that poor guy who walks behind the elephant with a shovel, alternately claimed that he and the president were simply stating what had been reported in the mainstream media, which is a lie, and then offering up the creative suggestion that as wiretapping was in quotes, it didn't mean, wiretapping. And then there was the claim that the British intelligence service assisted in the wiretapping, which the British quickly and vehemently denied. Now, to me, Jay, it's really clear what's going on here. President Trump got here's what I think. President Trump got all worked up about something he heard on Fox News. He made a series of extremely stupid and irresponsible tweets, and then he demanded his people support those tweets with whatever evidence they could cobble together. And so now they're stuck because Donald Trump is somebody who never apologizes, never walks back anything, and he's put his folks in the position of having to defend what's essentially indefensible. Well, what do you think, Jay?
Well, you're probably right, I think, on a lot of that. And again, the bizarre thing to me is that, these are tweets that came at like 6 a.m. and, made me wonder, perhaps it was all a dream or something like that, he
could say, I took this Ambien. Yeah. And it was just, that's,
you and I talked about this. There have been, reports that, Trump associates have been swept up in wiretaps. And we certainly know that Flynn was. Now, that was not a FBI criminal justice wiretap. That was a sort of general foreign intelligence, hey, we're keeping an eye on the Russian ambassador kind of wiretap.
Right.
So I think, now whether Trump does this intentionally or whether this is just the way his mind works, I don't know. I think he's sort of conflated that, and he takes it something that has a bit of truth to it. And I think there is a bit of truth that look, there may well be conversations that Trump had that have been recorded.
Right.
We don't know that, but he conflates it to Obama ordered wiretapping on me at Trump Tower.
Yeah.
Which I don't think happened, and all the evidence at this point indicates that it didn't happen. But his, it's one of these. Again, don't take him literally, but take him seriously.
Well, here again is a case where it seems to me that one of President Trump's biggest problems is that he can't get out of his own way, more so than most people. I mean, it's clear that he doesn't, he says these things and he does these things that maybe he thinks are going to work for him in some way. Maybe this is all some grand strategy, but honestly, I think that's overthinking it. I just think he sees these things and he reacts and he ends up causing himself a lot more problems than he needs to, especially since he can't seem to help himself and he can't seem to walk back anything. And if I were a conservative, I would be really disappointed because I would say, there was an opportunity here to do some things with a Republican president and a Republican Congress and potentially at some point in the near future, a Republican Supreme Court. And it's being pissed away by this guy who can't stay off of Twitter at 5 something in the morning and do dumb stuff.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, somebody has to take the phone away from him.
Yeah. Now, as a liberal, I'm fine with this in a way because it does distract from some of the, I think, really awful stuff he wants to do. Because, of course, on policy grounds, I object to a lot of the stuff he wants to do. But it's just puzzling, I guess. And I think I don't really think there's a grand strategy. I just think he's a guy who has a lot of trouble controlling himself.
I think that's right, and I think he is also he punches back, and he
lashes out.
He does that, in sort of broad strokes, and that's something that we haven't really seen in presidents ever, because it's typically sort of deemed to be not presidential. But especially attacking a former president and making these kinds of allegations. Like I said, he keeps saying he's going to have some evidence this week. And my sense is there is going to be something. I think there's going to be some sort of disclosure that, yes, someone, either related to Trump or Trump himself was somehow caught up in wiretaps, perhaps involving Trump Tower, perhaps not. But it's not going to be a President Obama ordered wiretapping of Trump Tower.
Right. Yeah.
That's not going to be. And to his, I don't want to say his credit, I mean his defense, the left does the same sort of thing of conflating stories sometimes. For example, how long did we talk about Russians hacking the election?
No, I think
they
that's
they didn't really hack the election.
Yeah. That's a great point, Jay. I totally agree. But I also would point out that it's one thing when BuzzFeed News is irresponsible, as certainly they have been, I would say. Yeah. But it's another thing.
It's the president of the United States.
Exactly.
Yes.
So
I agree. Again, I think that goes back to Trump doesn't see the difference.
No, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. Okay, finally, let's close on some economic news, some non-Trump news, Jay. It does happen occasionally.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
This week, the Federal Reserve voted to raise its benchmark interest rate a quarter point from 0.5 to 0.75% range to a 0.75 to 1% range, still awfully low historically. Now, the increase was clearly telegraphed by the Fed well ahead of time, and it's expected to be the first in a series of rate hikes over the next few years. Now, while economic growth has been nothing to write home about, unemployment has fallen, the labor market is showing clear signs of tightening, and so the Fed felt it should act in order to stave off inflation in excess of that 2% target rate it always looks at. And markets reacted well to the announcement. What about you, Jay? How did you react to the announcement?
I reacted well too.
Yeah, so did I. Okay.
Yeah, I think this is a good sign, and I think it's Yellen's doing the right thing of a gradualism sort of approach. The markets aren't getting spooked by there's going to be sudden increases, but we're recognizing that we're going to move out of that historic, lower, ultra low interest rates, and it seems to be sort of responsible management. And the fact that the markets responded as they did, I think, is even a better sign.
Yeah, I think
typically the idea is even a hint or a whisper of an increase in rates, results in a market decline, at least in the near term. So I think this is something that had been long anticipated, and it looks like it's being done gradually. So I think it's a good thing. It's terrific.
Yeah, absolutely, in presidential terms. So yeah, I agree with you, Jay, entirely. I think it was handled very well. I still have an awful lot of faith in the Federal Reserve, and it seems like they're doing the right thing at the right time. All right, well, on that positive note, that's it for this week's episode. Thanks, everyone, for listening. If you have any thoughts, comments, criticisms, or questions for Ask the Politics Guys, we would love to hear from you. Our email is mail@politicsguys.com. Our Facebook page, where we post throughout the week, is facebook.com/politicsguys page. And we're also on Twitter @politicsguys. Now, we'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the show and leave a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever podcast service you use. And sharing and retweeting our new show posts and tweets also helps out a lot. If you'd like to support the show financially, you can do that through the Patreon or PayPal links on our website. And if you enjoy the show, you should definitely check out the Politics Guys weekly newsletter. You can take a look at previous newsletters and sign up. They have it delivered to your email inbox on our website, politicsguys.com. The Politics Guys will be back next Sunday. We hope you'll join us.